Good afternoon. This is the, I think, seventh in the series of lectures on strategic planning for the poorest girls in the poorest communities. I'm here with my friend Barry Ravitch, who's going to be manipulating the slides, Natalie Hodges, a dear friend from a long time, and Naquan Davis, and thanks also to Vera David for helping prepare these slides. Today I'm going to speak about social capital. And the reason I've repeated the word 3 times, social capital, social capital, social capital, is that this is the core issue for girls. This is what happens to them. Apart from, there may be food deprivations, there may be school deprivations. The core thing that happens to girls is that they're deprived of that thing which means the most to them, which is social affiliation and social validation. We want to think about how to both analyze the presence or lack of social capital, but also see as a key role of all programs to build social capital. This becomes especially important now with all sorts of technology that for people who have social capital help them potentiate, Facebook, all sorts of social media. But if you don't have a network, if you don't have the wealth or the time, those technologies don't necessarily build social capital. They may harvest it if it exists. So it's very important to put yourself in the shoes of, or the bare feet of, a poor girl in a poor community. Her life is very different from yours, and I'm going to stress that in everything that I say. And if we get the social capital piece right in programs, we generally get the program right. So a few major concepts. The ozone layer we think about as protecting planet Earth. We have an increasing awareness that without the ozone layer, more and more of our Earth would be destroyed with, intense climate change, a burning sun, and a sense of destruction. So this is our home. The Earth is protected by the ozone layer. This is also our home. And what protects humanity is social capital and connectedness. If we can't trust the people around us, if we can't access them, then society breaks down. All the futuristic visions have, and they're often implicate these technologies we're so fond of, have people atomized, unable to connect. And what I think is born in every human being, but very especially in young females, and what they're deprived of so young, is their intense desire to spend time with each other, to feel validated, to be in a place like themselves. I often say to upper middle class females and males, imagine yourself in a situation in which you're going to be perfectly fed your entire life, looked after, but someone says to you, but there's just one condition. Every time you want to meet with someone who's like you, we're going to say no. You will never be with someone like you. We will appreciate you, and that often means we will use you, we will use your labor, but we're not going to give you that thing which you mainly want, which is to be with other people. When you commit a crime and you've done something particularly grievous, the conditions are the most shocking. You're put in solitary confinement. You're deprived of others like you. So for females, the desire for being affiliated with others is very strong, but that is precisely what they're deprived of from an early age. Girls of 8 move around their community with relative freedom, similar to boys of 8, but by the time you get close to puberty, and my colleague Kelly Holman, I hope in another lecture, will cover some fascinating data she's put together to show this graphically. Those worlds have literally shrunk. So the boys are accessing much larger spaces than the girls much more regularly. And the girls' world is smaller and smaller, and the time she has access to it has. Now that's terrible for her, but it's also terrible for society. This protective layer, who actually gets you to an emergency service when you have an obstetric emergency? It's called your friends. Who helps you when you don't have enough food? It's called your friends. Who helps you use your new information to protect yourself, protect your reproductive health? It's called your friends. Without friends, you're not going there. Here are some of the dimensions of social capital, and we have data in most places to give some hint of the both absolute and relative position of adolescent girls. The basic demographic positioning, that is, whether girls are in school or out of school by age, living arrangements, who they're living with, whether they're married, whether they're native born or migrant. These already become categories which may have very different social capital. We can measure non-family peer networks. You don't ask girls just if they have friends, but you ask if they have non-family friends, because the family for females, whereas it's protective and we're nostalgic about it, it's also the arena where females are exploited. When you give an asset to a female, the person most likely to take it from her is actually an intimate or a duty bearer. So non-family peer networks are protective in a way that family peer networks are not. Safety nets and comfort in the community. Can she move around? Does she have an emergency plan, even if it buys her an extra half hour, 24 hours from a threatening situation? Internalized gender roles. Has she already given up? Does she already believe she deserves to be beaten if she burns the food? Does she already expect to be harmed physically if she violates some rule? Degree of agency, decisions she actually feels she has control over, that she can unashamedly say, yes, that's my decision. She not only knows her rights, but she has the power to claim them within the locus of her community, not at the level, not nationally. People don't claim rights nationally. They claim rights in their daily life from day to day. So agency is very closely related to the environment in the community. Social participation and access to media. These are potentially social capital builders. They reflect social capital, but mistakes are frequently made in developing programs for disadvantaged populations of females who have very little access to media, or if they have access to media, it's not really salient. They can't act on it. It's at a high level of system for them. It's a message they cannot receive. Participation in formal programs. Right now, the scale plan for disadvantaged girls is that they at least have access to what's already in their communities. In even the poorest communities in the world, there's $200,000 to $1 million on the ground in many cases, in roads, in markets, in schools, in post offices, in health centers, in private investments. And it's hard to see poor communities this way, but they are investments. But our girls often not only don't have access to what is there as a matter of private investment, they do not have access to the formal programs which have been established often in their name. We have schools so girls can go. We have health posts because female health is so important. We have youth programs as a safety net, but no girls there. And then community power dynamics. You get something into the community, but how do you get it to the girl? What is the sequence that gets it? Is it sufficient to go through the development community when that development community is full of people who are not like our girl, often older males? So here are some facts. Girls are less likely than boys to have friends, and the poor boys, in this case is data that Kelly Hallman and colleagues developed in South Africa. Poor boys in some places have more friends than the wealthiest girl. And this is interesting because in a place like South Africa, we have actually in some places girls outperforming boys in terms of school going, but there's another dimension in which they don't outperform boys, which is the numbers of friends they have. In other data that Kelly has shared, and it's in other lectures, girls with more friends were less likely to be sexually coerced. It wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of protection. This is data from India. The peer networks of young women in India are limited and vary by status. So we see that just 22% of young women versus 42% of young men reported having 5 or more friends. We see that young women in northern states are somewhat less likely than others to report 5 or more friends. So we're married women versus unmarried women. Usually the young married woman, and let me also call her the young married girl, because age trumps gender in this case, is usually the least advantaged person in a community, the most socially isolated, those who stand to lose the most from not having friends because they carry a tremendously high health burden. Think of how many appeals they're made to help the mothers with children. The youngest mothers are at the highest risk of some of the worst outcomes, and they have the thinnest social networks. And we find differences by age, place, and residence, religion, and caste, which is applicable in India. And this was not shown in this figure, but friendship networks, this density, this social ozone layer, is at a very different strength depending on who you are. Girls have limited access and safety as measured in time and space. Some years ago when we began the work in Kenya, which has since flowered into some programs of really impressive scale, we asked a philanthropist here in New York to give us the money to have girls who were in the program developed by Carolyn Binti Pamojo to map the constituencies in Kibera. Kibera is often cited as the largest slum in Africa. I think there are about 1.2 million, or at the time we did the work, about 1.2 million people there, which 93,000 at the time were girls 10 to 19. The girls working in pairs in the constituencies and where they could work, there were some places that were simply too dangerous to do this, but there were like 13 constituencies. In the 12 constituencies, went and looked for places where girls regularly could meet and how many girls met there or could meet. In other words, looking ahead to a program that was going to increase the number of places a girl could go to meet other girls. But we found at baseline that less than 2% of these 93,000 girls had access to a girl-only space once a week. Now, just for a moment, whoever you are, imagine what it would be like if you knew there was just one moment, which for an hour, you could be with people like you. Just that one little watering hole. And in this case, this was a rare resource for these girls. And this is a community full of tremendous violence against women and girls, lots of risk. This is the map that shows the constituencies, and the darker colors show where there were more girl groups, which weren't a lot, but they were in that deep blue. And the line right down the middle, the sort of hypotenuse of if you see the sort of line that goes through, you see that below that's the railway track. Below that line, there was less social capital than above it. In thinking about a strategy for creating places for girls, we thought about, all right, so if we can't make a place for every girl to have a place with other girls, but let's think about how we can maximize it. So across these 13 constituencies, let's put things close to the railway tracks so that each constituency would have at least one place where a girl could get to, and by putting them along the central line, if possible, increase their access. I'm very much in favor of mapping, and one of the things that helps you strategize, think of it like a war. We're planning to give our team cover, a place to go. So organizing things at the peripheries may not be the best plan, maybe finding a more central strategy, in this case right down the center of the community, where feasible. So a goal when we did a scale plan for Kibera at one point was that we wanted at least 30% of the girls, which meant we were going to have to increase by 15-fold the spaces available for girls to meet with other girls, diversified by constituency, and within some standard of a walking distance for them. This is a small, densely populated community, by the way. I do note that peri-urban communities have as an asset their the density of population, but often a paucity of institutions. So the opportunity to build institutions, community-based platforms in these communities are of particular value to these girls, and they're feasible because of the population density. There's a striking contrast between where girls and boys can go, and this was work done in Burkina Faso. And this particular graphic contrasts married girls, 10 to 19, and unmarried boys, 10 to 19, and identifies places where they can go. So you can see that the unmarried adolescent boys go many more places. Look at those bluer places. Look then at the bluer places on the other side, where the married girls can go, many fewer. And then if I actually translated these into pixels on a map, let's pretend that the boys can go to 90% of the space, 90% of the time. Let's multiply that. That's 8,100. And let's pretend that the girls can go to 10% of the places, 10% of the time. That's a ratio of 1 to 8, I believe, 1,000. So you just, in terms of thinking about taking what people think of as qualitative data and coming up with some kind of access of social capital. The degrees of freedom of the boys, which only increases as they get older, girls it gets more difficult, is maybe a ratio of 8 to 1, 8 times more access just to the physical space of the community. Adolescent girls and teams can use geographic positioning systems to identify places of different degrees of safety. Some of you may have seen social mapping, where you ask people where they go, what they associate with it. You draw on the map you make by hand. The church is big, the post office doesn't even appear. You then are asked what places you can go more frequently, and you get a kind of intuitive picture. Well, we can do better than that. Those are fine, but we can translate that understanding actually into a graphic, quantifiable map. So in this case, and this is from our work in Guatemala, girl teams go into the community. In addition to finding out how many girls in each household and their ages, they walk the community. They go to the different points and they say, here's where it is. It begins at the railway station and then it goes to the well, and they define a community as they know it. It may actually be the first map of that community that exists, since the administrative units of small communities are often not drawn. And then within that space that they define as their community, you say, all right, so now what is, in this case, muy seguro, very safe, insecure, and dangerous. In this exercise, and many more sophisticated things have been done with it by our colleagues in Guatemala, led by Angel de Valle, you begin to see, the communities begin to see what they call a safescape. They begin to see, this is actually the world that our girls live in, which is different than our world. I move freely. I get up in the morning. Let's say I'm a 24-year-old male who maybe commutes to another community to work. I get up. I walk where I walk. I'm not afraid of the men at the end of the street. I can go near the school. If it's the rainy season, it's inconvenient. It's not more dangerous. I come back at night. It's okay, maybe a little more dangerous, but still, I feel secure. So the girls suddenly show a community in which not only do they report on what in the present time they've experienced, but they often could note places where once, maybe even 10 years ago, a girl was raped or there was a violent act. A good and decent girl is supposed to know where not to go. And if she goes there and something happens to her, it's her fault. If a young male gets his wallet stolen, he doesn't become unmarriageable. And it's not necessarily even his fault. It doesn't become kind of his lifetime story. But the girl faces a lifetime risk of stigmatization and blame for her insecure environment. So she therefore internalizes the most conservative possible view of what she can do, because it's her job to keep her safe. And we're not giving her the tools, another whole subject. That's where social capital comes in again. When these data were brought to the community in Guatemala, one of the first responses was, well, we don't really see the world this way. And they finally came to the conclusion that violence, and I thought this was fascinating, violence is something that makes you feel really bad about yourself, even to wanting to kill yourself. So they didn't acknowledge the levels of violence, but they did acknowledge the feelings the girls had about the things that had happened or could happen. And then they moved on to the analysis of why this happened. Great resistance to acknowledging that most violence against girls and women is homegrown and among duty bearers. It happens in your family, it happens in your school, it happens on the way to school, it may even happen in a religious setting. Now we're working in our next phase with this work to work with the community to make some accountable plans and say, this is a reality. If the corn isn't cut at a certain point, walking to school is dangerous. There's a nest of men in a bar there who attack girls. I just heard about a refugee camp just established, and they put the girls' school next to a mosque. This becomes a place that girls now can't go, not because of most people go to the mosque are a problem, but some people loiter around and make girls feel uncomfortable. So it's very important to validate the girl's vision of her social world and then take measures that increase her safe access. Community like this, imagine Saturday's the playing ground where you can't go, suddenly has a female monitor and girls walk together. A post office where you can get a savings account has a female there who's ready to greet the girls. There are some easy fixes, but we have to begin with a reality-based view of how girls see their world. Girls' relative access to social safety nets and their comfort in their communities, in this case the kebeles, we're now in Ethiopia, can be assessed around the bus station in Addis. Annabella Rulkar and her colleagues, I think, did really a definitive analysis of male and female safety. So they were working with young people. I think the ages were 10 to 24. And we have among males the not working and working females, not working in non-domestic work and domestic work. And then across the vulnerability category is never been to school, not living with parents. And let's go to have many friends and look across there for a moment and then feel scared of being beaten by someone in the neighborhood. So looking at have many friends, not working males, 62%, and we get down to girls in domestic service, 7%, almost a tenfold difference. This is like saying I think, on a social level, I've got 1/10 of the amount of food. This is very serious differentials. Feeling scared of being beaten by someone in the neighborhood. It goes from 13% among the non-working boys to 39% among the girls in domestic service. And this is another multi-times more frightening scenario. And remember, the consequences are different, because rarely does a girl simply get beaten. Very rarely does violence not involve some kind of sexual implication, sexual threat, one that attaches to her as a stigma. Adolescent females and males vary in their access to these safety nets. These are, again, questions which we began compiling from the work in Ethiopia and have added to recently from some of the work that we're doing in West Africa. So you ask someone in those preceding categories. So we have working, non-working males, we have not working females, we have working non-domestic females, and we have domestic workers. So now we're going to ask them, do you have someone to turn to in emergency? You've got a real problem, you've got to discuss it with someone, and it's an emergency, so it's time sensitivity. Do you have a place to spend the night in the emergency? I need to be out of where I am now. Do you have someone from whom you can borrow money in an emergency? Do I have a means to get food safely in a scarcity season? Because as we look at the data on sexual exploitation of girls, it's around scarcity times. Girls are used to mediate scarcity. Family doesn't have enough food. The girl sort of knows that she has to fix it for herself or for others. Let me look at each of these in turn and draw out some of the implications. Someone to turn in an emergency assumes that you've got someone who's not going to harm you. So in the case of Ethiopia, this work was accompanied by some very interesting case studies, and the girls reported that a typical scenario, having a dispute with an employer over their very low wages, about $7 a month. They don't have a safe place to put the wages. They've left them with their employer. They go to get their money. The employer says, look, you know, you used more cooking oil this month than I thought, so I've deducted $2 of your $7 wage, and that's for full-time work. Okay? I mean all the time. I mean being on call, no time off, okay? So she has a fight. They've got her money. She goes out in the street, and you can count in minutes how long it takes for someone to come forward and say, look, I'll help you, but there's a cost, and the cost often is, well, I'll give you a place to stay, but, and that may often mean sexual exploitation. So someone to turn to in an emergency who's a safe person, and you need an advanced plan for that. That's a protective asset. And it's a well-known scenario, and if girls are helped to understand how their scarce social capital translates into risk, they can actually have a plan, you know? They can actually say, okay, if this happens, I'm going to go to my friend, if she now has a friend, and talk to her, or here's where my mentor lives. But some social infrastructure to whom she can turn, as in the first case, for at least 24 hours of safety. A place to spend the night in the emergency, in an emergency, obviously related to the above, but literally a location, a safe house, just a place for one night. And I think we probably all faced it, gosh, I don't have a place tonight, and we got 12 people we can call. What if you had no one, and everyone who offered that was risky? Someone from whom to borrow money in an emergency. This is trust, and among people with limited resources, it takes a special amount of trust because they, you know, their own lifeline is on the line. So establishing emergency funds, when we do financial education and savings programs with girls, we never lock them completely away from their money. They have to have emergency money of their own, and they need to think about this. And another kind of emergency, which is foreseeable, is a young woman in pregnancy, and there suddenly needs to be money for emergency transport because of a, you know, pregnant delivery gone wrong. With planning, they can have these safety nets. And it means to get food safely in a scarcity season. This is both a long-term and short-term view, but an understanding that scarcity comes seasonally, the exchanges of sex for gifts and money and sexual exploitation in most places have some seasonality, so you can plan around that. And there may be some choices you make in the content of your programs, recognizing how core food security is, that one thinks about small collective plots, food distribution programs in certain times of the year, school feeding programs, in relation to establishing a basic safety net. One last thing to share. Very interesting new research from 10 Southern African countries, and they looked at what were the variables at the individual level most associated with having experienced violence, and I said it was usually sexual violence, and the top one was being in a household which had had one food security crisis in the year. So food security is very closely tied, is a very great part of the safety story. And there are important variations among adolescent girls. So they're discovering in their different segments, the younger girls, the older girls, in school, out of school, where there's scarcity and risk. We hear from girls who've made it into university in some of the developing countries. They're now at great risk going to the library, just as an example, having to borrow a book, having to interact with teachers. All right, this is the percent of 15 to 24-year-old females who think that wife beating is justified under certain conditions in India. Now, these data have been collected in the DHS, the Demographic Health Surveys, for over 100 countries, and we've mapped these, and we find very important variations, both by country and within country. I bring this up because it's not only a condition for the girl at the individual level, but it's actually addresses a key problem we have in encouraging people to do social capital building. And that is this. Any country you're in, you will hear the following phrase: violence against women is cultural, quote unquote. It's like saying the rain, the levels of rain is fixed. If it's cultural, why does it vary so much across countries? It's always unacceptable, but there are tremendous variations. We did an analysis recently in Nigeria and found a 10-fold difference in the proportion of girls who'd experienced sexual coercion under the age of 18, which ranged from 8% in the southern cities to almost 80% in the northern rural areas. The point is, this variation itself tells you that you can intervene. Now, in the case of India, looking at some of these data, you will see, go to the last column, what was the percent of girls, females, 15 to 24, who said yes to at least one reason. And you'll see immense variation. The national average hovers around 50%. But in Delhi, that number is less than half, 22.9%. And in Manipur, it's really high. It's 83.2%. This is an important indication of the internalized, what long-term lack of social capital and being in a risk environment does, is you basically accept as baseline, 50% have accepted that there's at least one reason where someone else is justified in harming them. Agency. These are data, and I should thank my colleagues KG Santia and Shireen Gigi Boy for assembling these data from India. Percentage of youth who independently made decisions on choice of friends, spending money, and buying clothes for themselves by selected background characteristics according to residence. Again, tremendous variation, and some interesting dimensions. You'll see the married girls are particularly disadvantaged in this. You'll see those that are unmarried and those that have been educated to 12 and above, and there's overlap there, are the ones who are reporting the highest levels of agency over decisions. But what's also notable is if you compare these data to males, and you've got about half the females, best case scenario, are saying that they made some independent decisions, but males will have a much higher level. One other thing to note is when females make a decision, I think I'll exercise control over an asset, they are almost always swimming upstream. When we develop programs for girls to give them protective assets and tools to make their living and to go forward with their lives, very often there's someone who wants to take it away from them. Even voting rights. I worked in the Middle East, and I remember there was a great moment in which the women in a particular country were going to be voting, and they were called to a tribal meeting to be told how to vote. So with females, you must look at not just access to, but control of a new asset and plans to give control, because even at these girls with 12 and above, only 50% are telling you that they have some control. That control may still come at a cost. Next subject, girls' informal participation and access to media. This becomes especially important because we believe so much in the transformative power of visual media, advocacy, social media, and so forth to make change. And we believe in wealthier societies that it's really about aspiration. You just want something different, very individualistic approach. It also assumes that being exposed to messages is the same as being able to use them, and that it's the same for different groups of girls. So these are data, again, from Ethiopia, from the rural areas, and they ask the question, and they contrast all boys and all girls, and then within the girls, never married and ever married. So picking out a few of the variables here, we have gone outside your home to meet same-sex friends. Well, males had much more of it than females, and the never married girls had significantly more than the ever married girls. Now, the ever married girls are the girls who society says we want to help, because those girls have the highest fertility, with children that are at the greatest risk, and their social isolation has lots of consequences. Now let's look to some of the solutions. Gone to church or a mosque, that's the one place where the ever married girls are going more often. That's a place they're allowed to go to. So when we organized the work in Amhara, a very large subnational region in Ethiopia, the married girls clubs met on Sunday afternoons. They took advantage of the acceptance that some females could leave and move about freely, to have the married girls club take place on Sunday afternoon with the church services, in this case mainly. Some were other religions, but Sunday afternoon was a time when most were free, that they would meet then, because there was a door a little bit open for them. Listen to the radio, we see significant differences between all boys and all girls, but also the ever married girls yet again. So how many programs have we heard about where we're going to address, maternal health and child health through radio programs and radio scenarios? They don't have access to these. Actually, we have some similar data from the urban areas, and the Girls in Domestic Service have almost no access. But what they also will say qualitatively is, even if I heard it, it really doesn't apply to me. It's not about me. So this isn't to say that there isn't media that's not important for these populations, but we need to get into those populations and be working actively with them for us to be able to decide what will make a difference. Recent evaluation of the Beirut TESFA program in Ethiopia, which is now reaching 61,000 girls with a core group of between the ages of 8 and 15 who are both living apart from parents and largely not in school. And we asked of the girls in the immediate area where the programs were organized whether they knew about the program, and there was a high level of participation, and there was a high level of girls in those immediate radiuses who knew all about it, I think north of 80%. What was fascinating that was in the control areas, which were geographically apart from where the program was, the girls had heard about the program. From a researcher's point of view, that's, oh, what a problem, the control isn't pristine. But what that also means is that these programs were so important that the word of mouth carried to the girls the idea there are programs for girls like me. In those same communities, there are undoubtedly billboards that seem to address and promote better off girls, school-going girls. But I'm a girl who sweeps, who sleeps on the floor, who doesn't eat enough. Those messages aren't salient to me, but now I've heard about girls like me having something. So I think there's a tremendous role for media sequenced correctly once we get inside the networks of the most disadvantaged girls. So what about the formal investment? When you speak about this lack of social capital and access, when you relate them to impacts the world cares about, the elevated HIV rates that one finds, the higher risk of HIV one finds among the poorest girls, even in the United States today. We're working in countries in which, at the beginning of our work, the ratio of male to female infection among 15 to 24-year-olds was 1 to 1. It is now in some places where we're working 1 to 8. In other words, you're 8 times more likely. But an average might be 1 to 3. If you're a female, you're 3 times more likely to have HIV. And a lot of the youth programs are funded, and their rationales based on, among other things, HIV prevention, mitigation, treatment. Well, who is in these programs? Tremendous skewing, elite capture, actually what they call inversion of care. Those who least need it are getting the most benefit. This is a social plan gone bad because there were no social capital assessments done and there wasn't a targeted recruitment. This is summary data, and there's much more for each of these countries, which show that, there's, first of all, there's tremendous bias female to male. Males get more, except in the case of Guatemala, it was more or less equal. And we looked at those. Those were basically females who were receiving, pregnancy services. They were not. It wasn't asset building, but the male to female participation in asset building and leisure is often very skewed to the male. Let's look at age. Pathetically, the 10 to 14-year-olds in Burkina, 7%. In Guinea-Bissau, 7%. Very poor reach to the younger, and if we cross-reference it with female, you'll find almost no females in many cases of the 10 to 14 age group. There's an issue about young poor males not being included in these becoming older male spaces, or these beginning with males of appropriate age. Let's say they're 17, but 7 years on, those same males that were 17 at the beginning are still there. They've secured the space. There's a male mentor. In the case of Mauritania, when we did this work, that was the only place in which we had to bring in enumerators, because they were unwilling to show the data, which was that 83% of the participants were males. The females that showed up very rarely, and there were a number of places they'd never even seen a female. And this is for centers and peer network programs, which have often raised their money, in the case of youth centers, with loans to countries to build facilities. Intergenerational debt, reaching the wrong people, actually creating new male enclaves. And then there's the age bias, worse in some countries than others. And again, it depends on where you are. If you've had these programs a long time, you may have a worse age bias, because you get a group at the appropriate age, which then just hangs on. So in Burkina, we had 63% were 20 years or more. The first work in Ethiopia had a number of well-known programs where not just it's 33% overall, but they had a number of well-known programs in which a very high proportion were over 25. Guinea-Bissau, 56. Guatemala was a relatively young program. We looked at it. I'd like to see it again. What we found in the study of Guatemala, that there was a single program in the whole country that reached rural indigenous girls, even though rural indigenous girls carried 6 times the risk of maternal mortality as the Ladino girls. So the Abriendo Oportunidades program responded in part to the absence in the official programming of resources for these for the indigenous girls. One other thing I should tell you, in that setting, almost more than 40% of adolescent girls are indigenous, and a much higher proportion, the majority of the most deprived girls are indigenous, and there were no programs to reach them, though there was a very active national program that had somehow missed this vital population. So it's very important to do a scan that lets people see exactly where young people are, exactly who is being served by the investment they made. Now, let's pretend that the girls are there. And so there was a program in Liberia which had a fairly good participation of girls. Beautiful center, densely packed area, terrific program. It was in an area where they probably had 35,000 people in close walking distance, and conservatively, about 4,500 of them would have been girls between the ages of, let's say, 5 and 19, something like that. And their center was full of, educational support programs. They had a youth-friendly service which had a high constituency of pregnant girls and girls who were sexually active. I went into the program where they was meant to be a sort of school support program, and there were 44 boys and one little girl in the corner, and I said, "Where are the girls?" And the man said, "Oh, they just don't come." I said, "But surely they're there." So we did this little exercise, and we could project the number of girls in the district who were aged 10 to 14 and out of school, and there were 558 of them. And we projected the number of girls 15 to 19 in secondary school, and there were 786 of them, and they're all in walking distance. The girls 15 to 19 in secondary school were 8 times as likely, these are the elite girls relative, to be getting some benefit than the girls who are unambiguously at risk, the 10 to 14-year-olds that were out of school, and they're all in walking distance. That center, and I think they worked on this, could have decided that, Wednesday afternoons and Friday afternoons we're going to have the younger girls, and we're going to have something for the younger boys and the older girls, and they could have taken their extensive asset and had age and gender dedicated sessions, mindful that there were groups who don't have pre-existing social capital. They were going to have to do recruitment. And one other rule, they have scarce resources. So you have to constantly recalibrate and retarget. Is it right that those who are better off are capturing a higher benefit? You may decide to give preference both in the numbers of slots and the timings of those slots to the least advantaged. These are, after all, the ones on whose back we raise the money for these programs. This is the characteristics of girls in a Asian program, where the organization had gotten into relatively small communities, poor communities, had done demand-led recruitment, and they impressively had 40% of the adolescent girls in the community had joined their clubs. When they examined the data, something that they're working on now correcting, they discovered that only 16% of the married adolescents had joined the clubs. They were hugely underrepresented, and indeed, you were 2.5 times more likely to be in the club if you were unmarried, meaning that you were better off. And these were places in which a very high proportion of girls were married as adolescents. This wasn't a small group. These were places in which you had lots of girls out of school and lots of girls who were married. A similar disproportion was found between the girls who were enrolled. The enrolled girls means enrolled in school. 50% of the enrolled girls were in the clubs. But only 22% of the out-of-school girls. Now, in effect, they had reached plausibly, if not the top 40%, they'd reached the top 50% rather than the bottom 40%. So typically, I've rarely seen programs that were mixed sex that didn't end up one sex, largely males, though sometimes all females, or begin schooled and unschooled that don't end up being schooled, and that may begin married and unmarried that don't end up being unmarried, which is that the higher status, more mobile populations will take it over. The other problem with that is not only do you have the wrong people, their loyalty is less because they've got higher opportunity costs. So if I'm a school-going girl, I may like this program now, but I got other stuff going on. If I'm an out-of-school girl, this is really precious to me. So there's a false economy in demand-led recruitment, which is not only that you get those who need it less, but also that their program loyalty is less. So in summary, at the formal level, virtually no programs apart from school are designed to reach younger adolescents. We're especially interested in this because of the issue of girls and the importance of age for girls. And girls' puberty is 2 years younger than boys, and socially is as much as 4 years younger. So this hole in the bucket, this is a Liberia case study. In early childhood, the emphasis on immunization, and I think Liberia is actually above the 90% I have here, of the kids who've gotten some or all of their immunizations. Impressive. And when we go to the adulthood measures, the metrics, well, 82.4% of the pregnant girls have had all of their antenatal visits. The problem is that 70% of the girls at the time this work was done had a baby by age 20. So why is that? That's the problem in the middle. 65% of the girls only, 10 to 14, are in school. So 35% of those girls are already seriously off track. And if they're not in school, there's not a program for them. So if the so-called youth programs, which should be called adolescent programs, aren't picking them up, you have basically between 3, when the little body has the immunizations, and 18, when she has her 4 visits because she's pregnant, which isn't necessarily a success indicator, you have no plans for her. One challenge, I think, to countries is for them to say we should have explicit policies for the 10 to 14-year-old age group that are differentiated by gender, because boys and girls are in very different places in those ages. Last thought, there's a model now that we go and talk to the, quote, community, unquote. That's not a neutral phrase. Who's the community? Who speaks for the community? With all the best intentions, there'll be a community development committee, let's say. In Upper Egypt, when we were doing the Ishraq program, the youth committee had a rule that at least a few members had to be under 50, because I can tell you most of them weren't. So the youth committee typically would be 7 people, no females, and 5 guys over 50 that you were going to be talking to. And you were asking them to tell you what the needs were of females, and particularly younger females. In some settings, these are guys who just picked up a new bride. We're asking them. In any other circumstance, If you were dealing with any other group, would you trust the community? When the civil rights movement in the United States, would you have gone to the community councils where no one of African origin had been registered to vote and asked them if things were okay with the African American community? Would you have given the resources to them that you wanted to get down? No, it would be absurd. But over and over again, we get we go and we ask the village elders who's hungry, and then we give them the money, or we give them the food rather, and they deliver it. So just as a general rule, I've divided things here into favorable access versus limited access. Capital cities have more access than peripheral cities. Other urban areas have more access than rural areas. Richer communities have more access than poorer communities. Community leadership of the dominant group is usually more powerful than the rank and file of the dominant group. Intact, richer families generally have more access, even though you may be dealing with poor places, there are still gradients, than poorer fragmented families. That is, where there's a female on her own or a family form that is not considered to be typical. Senior males have more access than senior females, and junior males have a lot more access than junior females. Again, in Upper Egypt, at baseline, before we started our program, the girls would say, to the answer to the question, should you, be guided by your brother in making decisions to come to the program? And they said, yes, including my younger brother, And one of the things that changed in the course of the programs is the girls changed their answer to, no, it's my decision. We also at one point mounted a program with some of the brothers after we'd seen this dynamic, because we believed that unless you begin with the junior girls, very simply, if you don't begin with the girls, you don't get to them. There is no trickle down. The water that started at the top of this has not gotten to earth. Furthermore, if you make direct investments in specific segments of less advantaged girls, you then actually can anchor a change power dynamic. Now inertia's on your side. If you support them and holding fast to what you've given them, everybody above them has more power than they do. So if they're interested in having what the girls have, they can get that. The reverse is not true. The males who say they want this, I'm not saying there aren't issues, but they are probably in a better position to get that than junior females who see their brothers getting something. We have scarce resources. We have scarce social capital. We have to focus it on the populations of the highest risk of the worst outcomes at the youngest ages. But the good news there is that they need this, they want it, they are loyal recipients, and once you anchor that resource around them, the wheel starts turning the other way. There's a virtuous cycle of two kinds. The people above them can begin to have and value what they have, but also these investments in the girls begin to turn around the dynamic, the health dynamic, the fertility dynamic, the HIV dynamic, the community participation dynamic. So they are overall a seriously good investment. It begins and ends with building the social capital of the poorest girls in the poorest communities. Thank you.